Welcome back to the Training Babble podcast. I'm your host, Dave Schell, and today we are back with Dr. Phil Batterson. Dr. Phil, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me back on, Dave. This is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, so we are taking a break from the fast physiology. I guess the listeners may not notice one way or another based on how we're releasing them. But the last time we were recording one of our fast physiology, which if you don't know what they are, they're just short 20 to 30 minute episodes focusing on one aspect of physiology. Last time we were talking about it, when we stopped recording, we started having a conversation about hyperoptimization and how it'd be great just to have an episode talking about that and maybe why that's not the best way to train. And so with that, why don't you tell us what hyperoptimization is from your view?
Yeah, so I've been watching a lot of, kind of like health and fitness influencer, sort of like Instagrams and YouTube videos and other things like that. And what everybody seems to be focusing on is this idea that there is this like perfect morning routine or this perfect way of eliciting the best increase in VO2 max or FTP or zone 2 or whatever the hell you want to talk about, right? It's essentially this idea that's the sentence is the best routine to improve blank, right?
Right.
That's what everybody is trying to find right now. And everyone's trying to find this like hyper optimal way of going about life. And what spurred this conversation and this thought process even further was this Reddit post that then was like, all right, guys, I got to focus on my morning routine, my workout routine, my dietary routine, my financial routine, my goal routine, my nighttime routine, like my blue light blocking glasses routine.
Yeah.
What do I actually focus on? Because that's too much time to spend in a day focusing on the optimal routine. And,
right.
And so Dave and I think, I don't know if we've ever said this like in our conversations, but we've definitely said it offline, but like normally we pick a topic, right? And we go and we kind of say, like this is what this topic is used for. And this is what we actually do. And most of the time it's finding a moderate ground for whatever that topic is.
Right.
And, I was joking with Dave. I was like, well, we should probably just call ourselves like the moderators or something like that, because everything we talk about eventually becomes, this idea of how do we actually get the most out of what we can do without losing so much time and thought into what is actually the hyper optimal sort of state that, we try to get to. And I know it's sexy to think about like the hyper optimization of things, right? This is where things like the Norwegian method come into play. Double lactate threshold days to optimally, gain as much time under tension near or at second threshold in order to push your threshold as high as possible. Sounds sexy, sounds awesome. But then in practice, like I was on another podcast, Running Explained podcast, she asked me and she said, hey, like, who do you think this would actually be good for? And I was like, in all honesty, 99.9% of people would not benefit from doing double lactate threshold days because your body just isn't ready and isn't capable of doing it. But I have people who reach out to me very regularly who are talking about, hey, I'm doing these double lactate threshold days. I'm not seeing any improvement, or, I'm always tired. I'm like this, that, or the other. I'm like, yeah, because you're not optimizing for yourself as the individual. You're optimizing based on this idealistic, blog post that was written or YouTube video that shows that these elite level athletes are actually, this is what they're doing. So all of that to be said, my idea of hyperoptimization is this idea that like, just because, or in life, everything has the perfect routine. This is what people think. But in all actuality, and I've said this on my podcast before, what is practical becomes optimal. So that's the lens that I always view things from. It's like for VO2 max training, what is practical becomes optimal. So if you can only get 1 day a week of VO2 max training and, you can only do 2 or 3 reps, that's totally fine because you're still getting stimulus for that VO2 max development, right? So that's my idea. I think we'll definitely get into this a lot more because there's a lot more examples than just say VO2 max. And I think what we can do is we can share, like our experiences with this idea of hyperoptimization, and then kind of talk back and forth about, what we actually use as coaches or work or use on ourselves in order to actually quote unquote optimize our outcomes. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And you use the word hyperoptimization, and I think of it when we first started talking about it is this idea of like life hacking, like finding shortcuts to getting faster or being healthier and stuff like that. And I think as we've started to discuss this, I've just started to think about it a little bit more. And it's like, I think I've always approached it from the other way. Like, what is the low hanging fruit? And so anytime I take on a new athlete, it's generally like one of three things. And it's like, okay, well, how much are they training? How consistent are they training? And then how much intensity are they doing? And I would say for the majority of athletes I take on, they're doing too much intensity and maybe not enough frequency or consistency, right? And so it's like just bringing that balance, or like finding ways that it's like, okay, like based on your life and based on your schedule, what is something that allows you to be consistent? Because as we've discussed over time, it's like consistency is what's going to lead to progress and progression. And I as we talk about life hacks or hyper optimization, I think so much of that is with this idea of like shortcuts to fitness.
Or just shortcuts to benefits in life, right? Like the entire biohacking community is kind of predicated on this, right? There's one study that was done in mice or yeast or, some single-celled organism where they show that, because you take this drug or do this intervention, there's an upregulation in this pathway, which then is then interpreted as, well, if I upregulate that pathway, then X, Y, and Z will happen and it'll be beneficial. And like, I see the merit in people testing that out, but again, it comes back to the low-hanging fruit, right? What are the big things that you can do that are going to move the needle, as opposed to taking that one, hyper expensive supplement with the hope that that's going to be the Band-Aid or the cure-all for everything, right? Like, it's just not how it works.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times the other way we could think about this is marginal gains. And so that was a big thing in cycling. And so, again, if we're talking about marginal gains, it's like a lot of times people can make improvements just by like improving their sleep habits, improving their nutrition, like not going and buying supplements, not like having to like purchase, powders and stuff like that, but just by eating real food.
Yeah. And eating enough of that
like
real
a variety
food, right?
of it.
It's like,
exactly.
Yeah. No, I actually cycling and I think triathlon are perfect examples of this, right? Because a lot of the times, and it's really interesting you brought this up, because I'm a firm believer that, everybody should do some level of like physiology testing as kind of like a regular check-in to see what is your physiology doing, how is it adapting to your training, and then, kind of getting a trajectory of where those different numbers are going and other things like that. But people are way more likely to spend, say the $300 to $500 that they could spend on a physiology test on upgrading their bike, their head unit on their bike or something like that, or getting like slightly more aero in terms of their like cockpit position, or buying something that is a half a gram lighter. Talk about marginal gains in terms of when you already have a $5,000 bike. Adding extra things to that is so minimal in terms of the performance outcomes. Whereas in my opinion, if you focus on the engine that is powering that bike, you're going to have a lot more potential for benefits coming out of that. So the gains from spending that $300 on a physiological testing battery is going to be has much more potential for benefit to your performance than, getting like that ceramic, coating on your bike chain or something like that. Right.
Yeah. And just going back to this whole idea of marginal gains, I think marginal gains are something that should be chased once you've exercised all other available options.
Yes.
Right. So once you're out of options and you're looking for like, where can I gain a few seconds? Because you're like, you're almost on the podium, or you're very close to winning, and you need to cut off a few seconds here or there. That's when marginal gains. But like up to that point, focusing on the fundamentals is going to have a lot more impact long term than those ceramic, the oversized pulley or things along those lines.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
I know, but it's easier, right, to just focus on that, because you're like, oh, I just got to pay, a few $100 and that, and then it's fine. And then I'll get, automatic speed upgrade, right? It's like, as opposed to what we're talking about requires you to put in the work, become accustomed with what's or attuned to what's going on in your body at any given moment, and reflecting back on that time and time and time again in order to get the most out of your body, the engine that is powering the bike, that is powering you running, swimming, so on and so forth.
So let's first talk about like, what is the issue with that? Like who cares if we're like trying to optimize and we're like life hacking? Like, why would that be a problem?
Yeah, I think what happens is, it sets you up for disappointment, because you see these influencers, you see these elite level athletes doing this one thing, and you think that is what is going to be the difference between you being middle of the pack age group and you being on the podium. And then you buy the supplement, you buy into the product, you do whatever it is, and it doesn't give you those changes. So I think from that perspective, right, you could wind up just being like, all right, well, that didn't work. So what's the next, kind of gimmicky thing that I need to chase? And it's this cycle of continued, disappointment, right? I'm saying all this stuff because I used to be, and I'm still fall into this trap quite often, where it's like, oh, if I just get my carbohydrate intake up to 120 grams of carbohydrate, per hour, like that's going to be the difference. If I do X, Y, or Z, or get this strong, that's going to be the difference. And it hasn't been the difference.
As you talk about this, I think I don't know if you've ever seen this motivational post, or like I've seen it posted on Instagram too, but it's like a picture of a glacier, and you can see underwater, and then you can see the peak coming out of the water, right? And it's like what everybody sees is that peak at the top, but it's like all the stuff under the water that like makes it possible for that peak to be above the water, right? And so like, as we're talking about influencers or looking at Strava, stuff like that, it's like, yeah, you're seeing these crazy workouts they're doing, but you're not seeing the years they've put into it and everything they've sacrificed and all these things. And a lot of times it's not a linear path either. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, like, so, and so it's like, we're just seeing the outcome of all the hard work they've done. And just because they happen to be doing the certain workout at this moment doesn't mean that's the workout that got them there. And I always like to think of, I always liken endurance training to steering like an ocean liner. You put in the inputs and it takes a long time to see the outputs, right? And so it's like, usually what you're doing now isn't what's affecting your fitness. It's what you were doing like months ago, years ago, is translating to what you're experiencing right now.
Yeah. And I think another thing too is that, this idea of hyperoptimization, for example, it's like, if you started to, like, you see the Norwegian method is a perfect example because it's very hype right now, very in vogue. And if you started to do that just because you saw, that the Norwegians were doing these double lactate threshold days, and then you decided to go out and, do this crazy training, and that was the only thing you focused on, chances are, unless you're doing something along the lines of 80 to 120 kilometers or even 80 to 100 miles a week, you're going to wind up injured, especially if you're doing it from a running perspective, because the amount of accumulation of pretty high intensity work that they're able to do based off of the double lactate threshold days is so high that most likely you're not going to be able to recover from it. And then you're going to, you're going to get burnt out. You're going to get injured, discouraged. And that is one of the things that I think, is the biggest limiter to continued success in endurance sports is if you don't have consistency, or if you lack consistency, then, how do you expect to continue to grow and build, your body as a system to be able to handle and tolerate those loads over time? So I think that's the most dangerous portion of hyperoptimization. The kind of most benign, portion of this is you waste a shitload of time and money and wind up finding that it didn't do you any good, where you could have just been focusing on getting better sleep, doing better nutrition, following the principles that we've outlined in terms of, training. Like for me, it's consistency, specificity, and progression. And I know there's other ones that you can expand in there too, but it's like, man, if you focus on those, yes, you're not going to see, you're probably not going to see like, those incremental gains of like, oh, well, I just cut, 6 minutes off my 5K time. But maybe over the course of a year, maybe 2 years, you cut 6 minutes. And then over the course of the next 2 years, because you're staying consistent, you cut another 6 minutes or something.
Right.
As opposed to like, here's another pretty good example. And I think hyperoptimization leads to very quick changes, which can be dangerous for the reasons that I've outlined. And here's an example of this. So when I was in high school, I joined the wrestling team. I've always been probably about like 150 to 160 in terms of my weight. And the first day that we got to wrestling, they were like, they did, like body composition sort of stuff based on skin fold measurements and other things like that, because they wanted to protect people from losing too much weight. That was the biggest thing, is they wanted to protect people from losing too much weight, because obviously losing too much weight too fast can hinder growth and other things like that. I had an interesting result of that for me mentally, was that I could lose up to 20, 25 pounds and still be considered safe. And then the coaches, what they did is they sat us down. They said, hey, you need to be eating a healthy diet. Here's what is consistent in those healthy diets, fruits, vegetables, other things like that. So I took it upon myself to essentially be like, all right, well, I'm going to try to lose as much weight as I possibly can, because that's the only way that I'm actually going to be able to compete with people, is being as light as possible and being, as tall as possible. Yeah. So during that entire season, I ended up getting down to like 135. So I lost 20 pounds in the course of a wrestling season, and, had moderate success, felt decent the entire time, got to track season, actually PR'd in, like all of my, sort of stuff during track, but wound up breaking my foot from overuse injury, because I was already starting to see the effects of, like probably malnourishment at that point. Right. Losing 20 pounds and being a growing individual is probably not the best idea. But that, just because I had those increases in performance, that actually resulted in a really poor relationship with food going forward, because I was always like, oh, well, I need to eat less to be lighter, to be faster, as opposed to thinking about it the way I do now, where it's, yes, I may not be able to get those gains as fast, but I need to be building my house, not by taking the blocks from the foundation and stacking them on top of each other, but by replacing the blocks in the foundation and replacing and building new blocks on top of that foundation. Because if I would have stayed consistent for, like the 4 years in high school, eaten enough, fueled enough, those sort of things, then I probably would have ended up in the exact same place in terms of time and performance. It was just a matter of hyper optimization. I put that in quotes because it actually wasn't. It was just a quick fix to a lack of discipline on my part and a lack of consistency. So I hope that, it's like I hope that highlights kind of like the dangers of like this idea of hyper-optimization. And yeah.
Yeah. I think what you're speaking to is it's kind of this superficial fitness or this shallow fitness where it's like you get it, but you don't have. I'll use running or I'll use strength training as an example. Like a lot of the gains in strength training can come pretty quick because it's not like your muscle cells actually growing. It's just your neuromuscular system saying like, oh, we want to recruit more like bigger motor units and stuff like that. But it takes time for the tendons to adapt to that. And so if you're just like, keep adding heavier weight, keep adding heavier weight, then eventually it's like you end up with like tendonitis or like tendon issues because those tendons can't support the weight that it like, and so it's like you need to do it like in a progressive manner that's like sustainable. And I think it's the same thing with fitness and these other things. I mean, you were talking about you injured your hamstring recently in running, and it's, you've been building up to it slowly, but it's like it could be something where it's like maybe you just haven't had enough time on your feet to like support the fast work yet, you know?
Or I went too hard on the initial fast day, and that kind of tweaks things where you like and speaking of progression, right? So I'll share a little bit more of what's going on behind the scenes for my fitness journey. So had a torn labrum, lower back got kind of messed up, which really resulted in me stopping most exercise towards the end of my PhD, which I think was pretty detrimental to like my mental health, my overall health, and other things like that. And now that I've moved graduated, moved into a new house, kind of been able to figure out a little bit more of, like my life routines and other things like that. I was like, okay, well, I really want to start running again because running does give me a lot of joy and fulfillment. So I was like, all right, this, I'm going to do it every other day. So, so we're not accumulating a lot of pounding on the body, and I'm just going to start at 5 to 10 minutes. Easy running, whatever pace that feels like for the day, we're just going to give it a shot. So I did that, and, I think I started 10 minutes every other day. And, it was like, sometimes I'd go a little harder up the hill, maybe run a little bit harder coming down the hill, those sort of things. But overall, it was very much like kind of controlled, the speed in a sense, not anything that was like, no strides, no sprints, nothing like that, because I was like, we're just building up, the foundation. And then I think this is kind of where maybe I went a little bit too soon is I did a VO2 max test and some other physiological testing and realized that my second threshold was butted up against my VO2 max. And so I was like, okay, well, I need to improve my VO2 max. And, probably the best way to do that is to do something along the lines of like, 1 minute all out effort, 1 minute rest. So equal work to rest ratios and stuff, because that's generally what's been shown to help improve VO2 max. But the problem with that is that I was like, oh, well, I've been doing, like on some days I would run, like the 10 minutes, the 12 minutes as hard as I possibly could, right? That's closer to probably like a 2 mile effort, or, probably a little closer to FTP rather than VO2 max. And I was like, okay, I'm feeling good. I could probably, if I broke that down into, 1 minute on, 1 minute off, do something faster and have enough rest in between. So the first time I did this workout, I was like, oh, well, I'm at 15 minutes. And, I think I'm going to try for 15 minutes of these intervals, 1 minute on, 1 minute off, accumulating 15 minutes of work. And, towards the end of it, your hamstring was felt a little weird, those sort of things, but didn't really think anything of it. I was like, oh yeah, it's just, my body didn't really know what it was doing, kind of crampy sort of thing. But really what I should have done is I should have just done, probably like 4 and just called it good, right? Be like, okay, well, because I have done no VO2 max training in the last little bit, what is the least amount of work I can do to elicit the most amount of gains? Let's just start with 3 or 4. See how we're feeling. We can, finish out the rest of the workout with a jog. But instead, my ego gets in the way. It's like, I could do 15. That would be fine. Well, I only got through 10 of them, and they were really hard, and I was dying at the end. So then I came back. I rested the rest of the week. Did a little bit of a more challenging workout on Friday. Came back on Monday, which was yesterday at the time of this recording. and was like, yeah, let's do it. Let's aim for 10 this time again. I think I got like 3 or 4 into them. My hamstring started to get to the point where it was like fully cramping up. And then on top of that, the ego getting in the way for the optimal is better. Like, the let's be perfect here. I got through 3 of them and just like, had like just a very small kind of discomfort in my hamstring. And I was like, okay, let's do one more and just see, let's see if I could shake it out. Right. No, you can't shake it out normally.
Yeah.
Got 10 seconds into the next one, hamstring just fully cramped up, and, then spent the next 40 minutes walking back to my car because I was as far away from the parking lot as I possibly could be. So when Dave and I talk about this, don't, like this idea of like, stay away from hyperoptimization, it's not because we're here just to like shit on this idea. It's because this idea has let us down in the past numerous times.
Yeah.
And, now who knows, like I had been making really, really good gains for the last 6 weeks. And now I don't even know when I'm going to be able to run again in a sense, because I can't really even walk around without having discomfort in my hamstring. So let alone running. Yeah.
No, and I think that's the big takeaway here is that when we go for these quick gains or the hyper optimization, the risk versus reward just isn't there a lot of times. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you got it. You did improve your VO2 max or whatever, but then it's like, but now maybe you won't be able to run for the next 2 or 3 weeks. And so then not only did you lose everything that you gained, but you have to start that process over again.
Yeah. Now when I come back in 2 or 3 weeks, I'll be starting at, 10 minutes again. And
yep.
It'll be really easy for the first couple of weeks. And, then we'll slowly build from there. But yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. And I mean, and then you start to think about it, right? Like I've also thought about this stuff from like a health perspective as well. And it's like, okay, well, if you're starting from zero after 30, 40 years of doing absolutely nothing, how hard is it going to be to change that or right that ship versus if you had been doing something every year or every day for those 30 years to try to maintain, right? I feel like it's a little bit easier. Well, you don't have to make as many course corrections, that's for sure. But and that's something too, like with these drugs that are coming out, that are like Ozempic, for example, where it's like claiming to, fix pretty much everything. But we don't know the long-term ramifications of taking that drug, and we already have good solutions for a lot of chronic health-related problems, and it's called not overeating and exercising enough. And I know it's way easier said than done because of the world we live in. It's just hard, to manage all that sort of stuff. But like, again, it comes down, in my opinion, to consistency, specificity, and progression. That's like with anything in life. So I think the purpose of this podcast episode for me is to help to get people to understand that really focusing on those fundamentals and everything is what's really important and what is going to be quote unquote optimal for the long run, as opposed to this hyper optimization, which is optimal for the short run. And this is, okay, now we're picking up steam. So this is where, like studies and stuff I think go wrong, because what we're doing in the research environment is we're trying to elicit the most amount of adaptation over the shortest period of time. So what happens is you get a relatively naive group of individuals, so sedentary individuals, for example, and you put them on an exercise routine that is totally foreign to them, because we know that whatever the things that you aren't doing, you have the most ability to adapt to in the short term. So what we do is we say, hey, we want to see what, how VO2 max changes, how second threshold changes over the course of 4 weeks in these individuals. And then what we do is we say, well, we think they could probably, recover in between, do like one workout, 2 days off, one workout. And we do that for 4 weeks. And then we measure the outcome variables, VO2 max, second threshold, performance, those sort of things. And then what we see is the greatest amount of adaptation, because we have just pushed these individuals harder for those 4 weeks than most individuals, should be pushed. If we expanded that training session or the training intervention to 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, so on and so forth, we would see a precipitous drop off in the amount of people who could actually maintain that. But we're not trying to figure out what, the long-term ramifications are, at least for most of these acute training studies. We're trying to figure out what the maximal amount of gain you can possibly get actually is. So even from a research perspective, we're almost looking at this hyper-optimization of training plans to elicit the most change in a single variable, rather than trying to say, well, what if we put this individual on a very moderate training plan? They're doing mostly zone 2 or lower work with a hard threshold session and maybe a hard VO2 max session in once a week with enough recovery in between. Well, the thing is you probably wouldn't see too much change in the first 2 weeks, maybe the first 4 weeks. But where the big gains start to happen is where if you inch it out longer and longer and longer. But the problem with that is that it's expensive to run human studies. And you're not going to get a lot of funding unless you're showing things that are actually making a difference.
Yeah.
So there's limitations for our ability to research, and a lot of it comes down to money. And I'm not saying that research, like that this research isn't important. It absolutely is important, and it's integral to our understanding of how training elicits adaptations. But I was listening to an interview with Bent Ronestadt, who's like, the king of kind of VO2 max intervals and stuff like that, amongst a lot of other things. Like he's a really brilliant guy. And it was really interesting because when asked like, oh, so how do your recommendations differ from the research that you're doing? He's like, I almost would never recommend somebody doing what we do for these individuals in the study because it's brutal. And you probably wouldn't be able to continue it for a long time. So what he says is you need to basically say, this is like the research that we're doing is the most you possibly could do, but you need to fit that in, with your individual, stress load and other things like that in order to actually stay consistent and gain those adaptations over time. And I think that's partially lost. And I don't do a perfect job of this either, because I share studies and I'm like, hey, this is what the maximal amount of adaptation is. But I think it's something where research gets a little bit of there's a misconception, behind like the research. It's like, oh, well, if I want to improve my VO2 max, I have to do 40/20s and accumulate as much time under tension as I possibly can and do that every other day for 4 weeks in order to, and because that is what is shown to improve VO2 max the most, right? But in all actuality, that's not practical for people, so therefore it's not optimal.
Well, and I think the big takeaway there is, like you said, it's like these people do it for 4 to 6 weeks, and then they go home and go back to their lives. Mm-hmm. They don't keep doing it, and they're not missing training because of it or what have you. And so, what is your advice? You and I think that was kind of the inspiration for this episode, is we were talking about different media outlets, or an article will come out or a podcast will come out talking about the latest study that shows this, and then that becomes what everybody wants to do. And so how do you evaluate that? And, how do you evaluate that and determine like what is worth adopting, or how do you modify it for someone with a 60-hour a week job that has 8 hours a day or a week to train?
Yeah. That's really tough. I think, I'm fortunate enough to be able to read research articles and understand what people are doing and how things are happening, and then be able to relate those to a little bit more of like real life. And that's actually kind of what my whole Instagram and critical oxygen business is kind of predicated on, is how do we reach kind of a middle ground in terms of, like what's the science saying and then what's actually practical for people. But I think what it comes down to is, if you think something is going to be beneficial to you and you see a study or you see somebody talking about a study, first of all, just go and read the abstract. Because within the abstract, you should be able to see what group of participants did they have? Are the participants similar to you? Are they, moderately trained individuals who, competed in triathlons or something like that? If so, then okay, then maybe this is something that's a little bit similar to your ability to adapt to. But if it's like a group of elite level cyclists that who are professional, who have VO2 maxes of 80, and they're trying to elicit the most amount of adaptations and stuff, then maybe right there, that's kind of a red flag in terms of being like, well, I probably shouldn't try to do 4 times a week of this workout, for example. I think it's a lot safer. Like if you're interested in trying something, right? Whatever it is from the research, it's a lot safer to do, one workout at half of, what it is that they're prescribing and just see how you feel. Because worst case scenario, you're like, yeah, well, I just did this workout. It was kind of hard, wasn't hard enough. You can bump it up one interval next week, right? And you can progressively increase that. If it's something you've never done before, then you absolutely stand to make gains from that over doing nothing or continuing to do what you had been doing, where the risk comes into play is that if you overdo it, like me with the hamstring, and then you're out for 4 weeks, then you just lost out on 4 entire weeks of training, as opposed to just missing out on 4 extra intervals or, something along those lines. So for individuals, that's kind of how I would approach it. And it's a lot easier said than done. Don't get me wrong. Like, ego gets in the way. We think we can do it. We see, all these awesome gains that people are making. Maybe we have an incorrect evaluation of what we're actually capable of and able to adapt to and stuff. But I would say that that's probably how I would approach it. How would you approach it, Dave?
Yeah, I think it's trying to evaluate it critically. And like you said, think about what exactly are they doing? How is it being measured? How are the outcomes being measured? And I think we kind of started you talking about some of these studies. They show that there was a upregulation of some certain hormone or something that is like a precursor to an increase in VO2 max or a precursor to something like that. And so it's like, just because there was I can't even think of the word right now, but there's some evidence of it, doesn't mean that that's what it actually led to. Right. And so looking and I think performance outcomes are probably the best measure. It's like if they did a time trial or if they did time to exhaustion or something like that, a 5K, then it's like, okay, that actually improved performance. And I think that's something you and I have talked about before, where performance isn't just about these physiological measures. It's also psychological. How hard can you push yourself? It's also efficiency. It's like all these other things. And it's not just what was measured in the lab, Right. And so I think that is something else we talked about with this whole idea around hyperoptimization, is that we get so caught up on improving our FTP or improving our VO2 max or improving, and we try to compartmentalize what these things are, but really it's like when we're training, it's not like it's in a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And so if you're doing 3-minute hard efforts, yes, it's probably working a little bit more on VO2 max, but it's also improving things below it and above it as well. Yeah. And so I think, I guess with that is we were kind of talking about this idea of FTP. And I think this is why you suggested this topic of hyperoptimization. I was asking, if we're measuring FTP with a 20-minute test and taking 95%, and that's most likely going to be above maximal lactate steady state, does it matter if we're training at 95% of maximal lactate steady state or 105% of it? And I think you made a perfect point. Really, the more important thing is how much time are you spending there? And if you're going at 105%, you're probably going to spend less time there than if you're at 95%. And so it's rather than getting caught up in these percentages and hyper-optimization, it's really, again, about the fundamental, the basics and consistency and how much time you're spending there consistently.
Yeah. It's about figuring, so this is where that specificity comes into play, right? Like if you want to get better at doing a 90-minute bike ride, obviously this comes with some caveats, like you're already kind of trained, you've been doing training plans in the past, other things like that, then the single best way of getting better at that 90-minute time trial is to practice specifically at the intensities you expect to ride that 90-minute time trial at. You will see some benefits to your physiology. If you're doing, kind of like the zone 2 stuff, you'll see some benefits to your physiology and probably your performance if you're doing VO2 max stuff. But the biggest bang for your buck in terms of return on investment for improvement in performance of that 90-minute time trial is going to come from doing work at or close to that intensity that you're expecting to do the 90-minute time trial at. And this is where I think people get a little bit, get a little bit confused as they see, zone 2 improves your capillarization and zone 2 improves your mitochondrial volume density. And this might be another topic for another day for us to expound upon. But like I have dug through a lot of research, and I like to think that I'm actually pretty good at finding research that supports or, refutes different hypotheses and stuff. And I've never found one study that looked at a comparison between just zone 2 work and then just high intensity work in terms of capillarization and mitochondrial volume density. But what I will say is that high intensity interval training has been shown to stimulate pathways that are related to capillarization of, the muscle fibers. It's also been shown to increase mitochondrial volume density. It's also been shown to increase mitochondrial function. So right there, we can already say, well, zone 2, like zone 2 and HIIT training both confer the same, sort of benefits. And then on top of that, I think it is a little bit misconstrued in terms of, well, zone 2 training is going to be, what really changes people's, muscle physiology, right? Because I think a lot of times with the zone 2 training, it's less overall stress. So you have to do more time and more volume with it in order to actually get those adaptations to occur. So for most of us, it's not plausible to be like an elite level athlete and do, 10, 20, 30 hours of zone 2 a week. And this is where I think a lot of those recommendations in terms of why zone 2 is so beneficial are coming in. Is they're saying, in my elite level athletes, we do 20, 30, 40 hours a week of zone 2 training. And then the rest of that is a little bit more higher intensity. And I can tell you that, capillarization and mitochondrial volume density are increasing because we're measuring those markers and stuff. And it's like I'm not saying that zone 2 training isn't good for other reasons. It's really good at helping you facilitate recovery in between hard workouts. It's really good at turning over substrates and probably stimulating pathways for, different, fatty acid oxidation and other things like that. But I'm not convinced that just doing zone 2 training is going to be the end all be all for your performance if your effort is to do, a 90-minute time trial as fast as you can.
Yeah.
That's my, so that was a little bit of a tangent, but the bottom line is that you need to do things that are specific, or every exercise that you do is going to have some level of adaptation across the physiology spectrum, whether that's increasing your cardiovascular, capacity, whether that's increasing capillarization, mitochondrial function, mitochondrial volume density, as long as the stimulus is adequate, is high enough. But different intensities of those efforts are going to stimulate specific adaptations that are going to help you get better at those specific intensities. So if you're always going slow, if you're somebody who just does zone 2 training all the time, you're going to get really good at going slow.
Yeah.
That's what it comes down to. You can't expect yourself to become an elite level miler by just running zone 2 work. You have to do work, that is close to your mile race pace effort in order to actually realize the full potential of those gains.
Yeah. No, and I think one thing to keep in mind here too is that like the old, as you were talking, I was thinking about this article that was like, oh God, what is it? It's something about like base training needs to go to the way of the dodo or something like that, or zone 2. And it's making this case that it only works for pro athletes that are training 30 hours a week and stuff like that. And so this goes back to this idea that we're always looking for the answer, the one answer. It's like, oh, okay, then we just need to do only high intensity and stuff like that. And it's like, no, that's not it either. It's like, this is where we come back to this moderation thing, everything in moderation. And it's like, no, you need to do enough of that moderate intensity work that so doing an hour or 2 a week of zone 2 isn't going to do anything for you.
It's not going to do anything it's not going to be better in terms of the adaptations to, say, capillarization, mitochondrial function, those sort of things. I still think it could be beneficial.
But I'm saying if somebody's habituated to that, if for the last 10 weeks you've been riding zone 2 hours a week, then it's not really going to do much for you. Like it's not enough of a stimulus to drive adaptation. Doing 10 hours a week of high intensity work isn't realistic, and isn't the other thing. And so I think that's where people kind of get into this thing. It's like, okay, yeah, if you have only 2 hours a week to train, then doing it all in high intensity is probably going to be more of a stimulus than zone 2, right? But it's like, if you're training for longer endurance events, stuff like that, big reason I train is because I like to ride my bike. And so if you want to ride your bike more, it can't all be high intensity. And so that's where the moderate stuff kind of fills in the gaps. Right.
It comes back to this idea of what is practical becomes optimal, right? You know, like you're riding your bike because you enjoy riding your bike, right? It's like, so, and you can't just expect to just go out and just hammer, every single day, right? Because that's a way of burning yourself out and not being able to ride your bike as much as you want. So, and it's also the same, for actual training purposes, right? We find that, I don't know, I've seen numbers thrown around where it's like, typically 1 to 2, days of high intensity, interval training, maybe 3 if you're somebody who can handle and manages their intensity and volume within that intensity enough. But like, even if we say 3 on a good week, if you can do 3 hard days a week, then what do you do in the other, few days, right? The other 3 days of training, right? It's like, if you don't do anything, then, doing something like even walking at that point, right, is going to provide some level of stimulus that is above your baseline stimulus. But for most of us, it's riding or it's running or it's whatever it is. And it's, but it needs to be easy in order to facilitate the coming back and doing more of that hard work the next time. And the way that I kind of think about it in terms of, adaptations and everything is that high intensity work is if you're trying to sculpt, like the statue of David or something like that, and you want to kind of take big chunks out of the statue, then you have to do high intensity interval training. That's what high intensity interval training does, is it takes big chunks out of this block of granite or marble. And then the zone 2 training allows you to kind of hone it in without the risk of breaking or cracking the marble. Because if you do too much of breaking off of those big chunks, you run the risk of breaking David's arm off, right? Yeah. Or, doing something along those lines. So it's a balance between, how do we get a lot of stimulus, a lot of bang for our buck in terms of adaptation, while also allowing for enough recovery to happen, allowing for our bodies to adapt and recover, that then keeps us consistent. Because the longer you do that of, taking a chunk out, kind of finely tuning it, taking a chunk out, finely tuning it, taking a chunk out, finely tuning it, the better your statue is going to look, right? So, but as soon as you get a crack in it and, lose an arm, then that's when you got to start over. So it's like, so bottom line is, we've kind of talked all over the board here, but I think what I'm getting at is that, there's no one right or wrong way to do things. You need to figure out what allows you to stay consistent, specific, and progress over time. And Dave, what other basic principles, should we touch on here? Because I think, we've talked a lot of, kind of smack about, the like the hyper optimization and stuff like that. But like, what can we give people, for the last 10, 15 minutes of this conversation that's going to be like true tangible takeaways like that you focus on when you talk to people and other things like that?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would say is like just asking you, and I'll touch on this too, is like, what are some of those reliable sources, or what are things to avoid? And so when we're looking for the next thing, like, I guess let's start there. What do you avoid?
I have a tendency to avoid people who speak like they have all of the answers. And, one way or the other, this food is bad for you. This is the perfect exercise for you. This is exactly what you need to do. Because if you're familiar with anybody in, academia or just very intelligent individuals, when you start to talk to them, most of the time, the answer is it depends.
Right.
Or it's, how do I get more context out of this before I actually answer?
Yep.
So a good coach, right? And like, I think everybody has room to grow and all of that sort of stuff. But a good coach, if you come to them and you say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what I want to get better, they will follow up and ask more questions to get to the bottom of things before starting to prescribe things. If you get somebody who is immediately like, oh, you're tired all the time, then this must be the answer to this. You're like, right. And I've grown accustomed to detecting that sort of thing. It's really hard because, for example, like the first person that comes to mind when you say somebody I don't follow is this guy on Instagram. I think his name is like V-Shred or something like that. But he's like, he's got this like diet thing. And he's like, oh, here's the answer to all your diet problems. And you can eat pizza and you can do all of this. And it's dependent on your body, your body style or your body type, right? And first of all, body type is a long ago bullshit term that was made up. So first of all, my bullshit meter's going off. And then second of all, it's like, he's telling everybody he's got the answer for everything. And this is what everybody's been doing. And, he knows everything. Just go and sign up for his, $1,000 course and then he'll tell you everything. So that's what I stay away from. The people I do enjoy following are, guys like Jason Koop, for example. He shares unbiased research, or he shares his own opinion, that's unbiased on the research that's coming out. And he's really focused on helping people become better. And I think he even made a mention of like, he doesn't take on sponsors and other things like that because he doesn't want his judgment to be clouded or biased by money that's coming in.
Totally.
And I just watched a video today that was like, all of these big influencers, right? Like the big podcast. I don't know if Rogan does it, but Huberman, Peter Attia, like are all getting paid a lot of money from a lot of different companies. So be skeptical with some of their recommendations, right? Because they might stand to make millions of dollars on recommending, one trackable fitness device versus another. So look into that too. Look into, what sort of, monetary interests they have. Like, for example, I work for Moxie Monitor, and this is something that, I definitely have a bias towards recommending Moxie Monitor over other NIRS devices. But I also approach my discussion of things like physiology and other things like that, I think, in a more tempered way, where I'm not like, oh, everybody's got to buy a Moxie Monitor because it's going to change your life. I say, this is what it's useful for, and this is who it's useful for. So that's what I look out for, is just like, the people who are telling you that this is the answer and this is the right way to do it. And I stay away from them. And then I follow the people who are sharing research and not putting opinions behind it. I follow people who are sharing their opinions and, talking in more of like an it depends sort of manner.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yeah, as you were talking about that, I started thinking about how I approach it. I think one of the big things you said is like super important is be skeptical.
Yes.
The other thing is if it's new, Jason, ironically, Jason Coop and I did a podcast on called Flattening the Hype Curve. And that was a long time ago, but it was all about this idea is like something comes out and everybody's really excited about it. So if you've ever seen the hype curve, it's like it starts with the peak of inflated expectations and then the trough of disillusionment and then the plateau of productivity. And so I guess in my kind of thinking, I'm always like when new stuff comes out, I'm always waiting for that first wave to like see what actually makes it through and what sticks around and what like stands the test of time. And so because of that, I'm looking at like what's been tried and true. What are the pros doing? Like, what have pros been doing? And that's one of my big things is like, if it worked and if it was the magic thing, every pro team would be doing it. Every pro would be doing it. Right. And then, the other thing is, like you said, if it's black and white, like being really skeptical about that, the people that are trying to sell something. And then, I think just as I've had the opportunity to speak to like some pretty high level coaches and stuff. And, when I was traveling, I went to the Australian Institute of Sport and British cycling, stuff like that. And I feel like the higher up I went, the simpler it got. And it's like, that was something that always like just really struck me as it was like back to basics.
Right.
Like, and that's been my own coaching journey too, is like, it got more and more and more complicated. And then as I get more experienced, it just like goes back to the basics, like volume, intensity, consistency. So like really what it comes down to,
Yeah. Yeah. I think there must be something psychologically that, humans in general think things that are more complicated are generally the better solution because that's what we see, right? The next pretty thing is always the thing that is like, seems to be the most complicated in terms of, like I'll pick on CrossFit for a second. When I was doing a lot of CrossFit, one of the things is you constantly vary things over, different time intensities and times and workouts and other things like that. And I think that works really well for group classes because, people can drop in on any day. It's going to be a different workout. It's going to be kind of, like got that little extra spice to it and other things like that. And, when you read like the CrossFit documentation, everyone talks about how, this is going to be like the best way to gain adaptations and other things like that. And I mean, we see time and time again that, you have to do some level of consistent training in order to maximize the adaptations to something, right? So if it's like, if you did one VO2 max workout a week or one VO2 max workout every 3 weeks or something like that, you're not going to get the most adaptations compared to if you did VO2 max once or twice a week. Right. So when you do something where it's just continually varying things and all that sort of stuff, it works probably for 6 to 8 weeks, in terms of, say, strength training, for example. And then all of a sudden people are hitting a plateau and they're really frustrated because they're like, I used to, adapt so quickly. And that's because, your body was on the path of quick adaptations. And now you're trying to get those foundational adaptations and those sort of things. And it's like, I think that if CrossFit really looked at the basics, and this is what I try to help people with, is like, let's cut through all of like the science or just like all of the BS. And let's just say, okay, well, you have to go easy sometimes because you have to recover and you want to build volume, right? You have to go hard sometimes because going hard is going to allow you to handle those hard efforts that you need to do at some points in your life. You need to probably, I'm talking about from a health perspective, you probably need to lift heavy, right? Because there's probably going to be times where, you slip and fall or, you need to lift something heavy up onto a top shelf or something along those lines. And if you don't do it, you're never going to be able to do it. And, so it's like very simple things like that. or sleeping enough, or creating habits that allow you to, to be productive throughout your day, or other things like that. So it all comes back to figuring out what the basics are, what becomes, practical, becomes optimal. And, it's like, stop chasing that shiny object. It's the shiny object syndrome. Everybody thinks that, if something looks good and sexy, then it must be better than, kind of the boring, like the squat rack in the gym, right? That thing looks freaking boring. It's, like no paint on it, like all that other shit. But that is probably the most effective piece of equipment if you can lift, or if you can squat correctly, compared to anything else that's out there, right? As opposed to that new shiny Pilates machine that's going to like bend you in 8 million different, directions and all this other stuff. So yeah, that's my approach to things, is like how can you simplify things as much as possible and stick to like the basics of adaptation.
Yeah.
And I think it really comes down to understanding what levers you're pulling, with whatever workouts you're doing. Because if you start to understand those, right, then it doesn't really matter what you're doing. It just matters how you're applying those principles and then extending those over time.
Yeah, and I just want to touch on what you just said. Like, I think people are, speaking of being skeptical, I think people are skeptical of things that are simple, and that if it's simple, it must not work. Like, that can't be right. It's too easy, right. And it's like, but it really is that, like, the very basic stuff and just doing the fundamentals right consistently over a long time that leads to sustainable progress.
Mm-hmm. I know. It's it's funny. This podcast, kind of did the exact same as all of our other podcasts, where it's like introduce, this idea of hyper optimization. It gets super complicated, all of that. But then at the end of the day, we're like, yep, make it simple. Like, one of the things that changed one of the things that has been the biggest effector of my habits within my day is just essentially wearing the same thing every single day. Like, I have a bunch of solid color t-shirts. I have a bunch of solid color hoodies. I have the same pants that I wear, and it eliminates a lot of decision that I have to make. And so then I can focus that on other more complicated things.
Yeah.
So it's like, if you can simplify your training plan, so you're not doing something where it's like, well, I do, like 5 minutes on at 105% of my FTP, then I bump that down to 103% of my FTP, then I go under my FTP for 95% of the time, then back up. It's like, why don't you just ride for 20 minutes at 100% of your FTP or 95% of your FTP? Yeah. That would probably get you almost the same exact things and make it way less complicated in terms of having to program your workout, other things like that. And it's like, but I don't know.
Yeah, that sounds like another episode. Well,
yeah,
that'll be our next fast physiology, I think. So make note of that.
Yeah.
Where can people find you?
Yeah, as always, you guys can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. That's where I do, most of my conversations and business and stuff like that, at least to begin with. You can also find Dave and I on my podcast, which is the Critical Oxygen podcast. That's on, Spotify, Apple, Google, YouTube, all of that sort of fun stuff. So if you actually want to watch these podcasts, you can go to YouTube. If you guys have any questions or just anything you want to discuss, please DM me on Instagram. I'd be more than happy to talk to you guys about this sort of stuff. And yeah, if I'm always interested in learning more. So if you are a researcher, if you're, a coach who, has topics or other things like that you specialize in, please reach out to me, because I'd love to have those conversations as well.
Very cool. Thanks as always for your time. Look forward to the next one.